In 1920, John B. Watson, a renowned psychologist, and Rosalie Rayner, his assistant and eventual wife, decided to combine love, science, and a fair bit of cluelessness in an experiment that would go down in history as the Little Albert experiment. The idea was bold, the execution debatable, and the results as ethically murky as a midsummer mud puddle. Thus, in a story one might mistake for the beginning of a Dickensian epic, Little Albert's fate was sealed. So, today on Weird History, hide your kids from the Little Albert experiment. But before things get too far, make sure you've subscribed to the Weird History channel. After that, leave us a comment and let us know what other psychological studies you want to hear about. Now, what was worse for guys named Albert? Meeting J. Robert Oppenheimer or the following experiment? John B. Watson, perhaps inspired by Ivan Pavlov's famed experiment with salivating dogs and ringing bells, thought he'd take the idea of conditioned response in a different direction. Why condition hunger when you could condition terror? And why test on a dog when you could traumatize a child instead? Apparently, he felt Pavlov just hadn't gone far enough. The goal was as clear as it was questionable: to condition fear in a small child and see what happened, ideally without getting anyone hurt. The test subject was a 9-month-old baby nicknamed Little Albert. The setup was straightforward. Little Albert was introduced to a series of innocuous white furry objects, most notably a rat. As Albert reached toward the furry critter, Watson struck a metal bar with a hammer right behind the infant. The baby was, predictably, startled and uncertain as to what had happened. This process was repeated until Albert began to connect white furry objects with a loud, frightening noise, causing him to react with terror at the mere sight of anything that had both fur and a bright hue. The test was technically a success. Little Albert, once blissfully unaware of the terrifying aspects of rabbits, cotton balls, or Santa Claus masks, was now properly conditioned to find anything white and fluffy as terrifying as anyone's worst fear. And Watson kept observing Albert's newly acquired phobia, apparently oblivious to the ethical quagmire into which he was sinking. To call the experiment unscientific would be like calling a volcano a bit warm. Ideally, scientific experiments should include parameters like objective measures, control groups, and a sample size larger than one terrified infant. Alas, Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, skipped past all that, embracing instead a style of personal observation that feels strangely like guesswork. There were no precise metrics, no scales, and no control group of other babies with which to compare their results. In short, Little Albert's fear was only being measured against itself. When Watson recorded his findings, he was thrilled to note that the conditioning had worked. Albert was visibly upset by white, furry things, which was enough proof for Watson to declare victory. Yet to any budding researcher, the celebration would have seemed a bit premature. Experiments are always more than the initial hypothesis. They are the culmination of elimination and repeated effort. What if Albert was just having a bad day? What if he was already predisposed to dislike the color white? What if the testing environment itself was having a greater effect on Albert's reactions than the sudden loud noise? Watson's reports didn't answer any of those questions, instead opting for a summary approach to his findings that drew questionable conclusions based on very thin evidence. After concluding that Albert was thoroughly conditioned to loathe all things white and fluffy, Watson and Rayner just kind of stopped. They ended the experiment, making no effort to reverse the conditioning, assuming that Albert's color-based terror would simply wear off over time. Much like the tests themselves, this assumption was not based on any scientific evidence. Little Albert's mother reportedly packed up and fled town, presumably afraid that Watson would hunt them down for another experiment, like mad scientists do tend to do. Watson's parting words suggested that Albert would simply grow out of his fears after experiencing some of life's rough and tumble. This sentiment is perhaps better suited to things like skinned knees or stolen lunch money, but at least he made an attempt to be his version of reassuring. In any case, Albert was gone. The experiment was done, and Watson's controversial experiment would be filed away in the great catalog of scientific missteps. During his experimentation, Watson waxed poetic about the exemplary health of little Albert, one of the best-developed youngsters ever brought to the hospital, Watson noted in his 1920 paper, citing the boy's unflappable demeanor as proof of his suitability for the experiment. But it wasn't long before scholars began to poke holes in Watson's rosy description. Some suggest Albert may have had developmental delays or neurological issues, raising a massive red flag that would impact the results of any tests. Obviously, this possibility is something a reputable researcher would have eliminated before beginning any experiment. But reputable and John B. Watson have rarely occupied the same sentence. Watson wasn't around to address these allegations, and what's more, he burned all his notes on the experiment before his death, like what mad scientists do tend to do. It was a dark time for child welfare and research. There was no such thing as informed consent. If you took part in an experiment, you just had to trust that the researchers weren't lying to you about what they were doing. It wasn't until decades later that psychology, spurred by stories like Little Albert's, began to seriously consider the ethical implications of involving infants in this type of study. Psychologists across the world eventually agreed that babies are, in fact, terrible test subjects for fear conditioning. A child is just beginning to make associations at that stage and is unable to articulate any kind of complex thought, so placing one in a behavioral conditioning study has little scientific value. The only thing Watson was accomplishing with his experiment was scaring the hell out of a random baby. The American Psychological Association would eventually instate guidelines aimed specifically at keeping babies and other unwitting participants from being subjected to terror for the sake of science, presumably hoping to never encounter another case like Albert's again. Sorry, Bill Nye, sometimes science doesn't rule. Due to Watson's meticulous and quite literal attempts to burn all bridges behind him, Little Albert's true identity remains as shadowy as a Bigfoot sighting. But there are theories. Some researchers believe Albert was Douglas Merritt, a child with hydrocephalus who tragically died young. This, of course, only added fuel to the ethical dumpster fire. What if Watson had knowingly traumatized a terminally ill child? If he had known, we have no doubt he would have addressed such a gross ethical oversight by saying, what can you do? In 2014, a group of Canadian researchers suggested another possibility. Little Albert may have been William Albert Barger, a man who lived into his 80s and, most notably, had a lifelong fear of dogs, no matter the color of their coat. Although this hasn't been completely verified. The stories diverge, the mysteries multiply, and the scientific community remains split over which Albert, if either, was really the unfortunate child in Watson's experiment. It's also possible that nobody wants to claim Little Albert as their child because nobody wants to be seen as the parents who signed their baby over to Dr. John the Potbanger. But there are no records of Albert's folks, so it's unlikely we'll ever know the full circumstances of what led them to subject their baby to Watson's experiment. Regardless of the details, one fact stands clear. Watson's legacy endures, if only in the cautionary tales told to psychology students. In the wake of Little Albert's eerie legacy, psychology went through something of an existential crisis. What did it mean to be a scientist? Was anything permissible in the pursuit of knowledge? The academic world slowly agreed that ethics mattered, and that perhaps children shouldn't be subjected to frightening experiments for posterity's sake. Modern researchers now know to avoid traumatizing infants as much as possible, and to find less potentially harmful ways to conduct conditioning experiments. Furthermore, Watson's notorious endeavor inspired the creation of the APA's Code of Ethics, which, despite not being formally established until 1953, effectively did away with the Wild West approach to science favored by Watson and many others. Rather than confirming Watson's theories, the Little Albert experiment demonstrated the need for ethical research standards, regulation, and reliable methodologies in scientific study. We may never know for sure who Albert was, but his story had a permanent effect on the entire world. Dr. John B. Watson, meanwhile, left psychology behind for a successful career as an advertising executive, like a mad scientist would. Every year, millions of hours and billions of dollars are poured into medical innovation, seeking new methods of improving, sustaining, and extending human life. Nonetheless, some of the most significant medical discoveries in history, without which many of us wouldn't be here today, were made completely by accident. So, today we're going to take a look at some major medical discoveries that happened by mistake. The coronary angiogram is an X-ray that examines blood vessels. And when F. Mason Soanes Jr. accidentally invented it, he didn't just think he'd made a mistake, he thought he had killed someone. And that's the opposite of medicine. In 1958, Soanes was overseeing the injection of dye into a patient's aorta when the tube slipped into the right coronary artery, filling the vessel with contrast. At the time, the belief was that contrast dye could be inserted into the larger vessels of the heart, like valves and chambers, but that putting it through the coronary artery themselves would cause a lethal blockage. After shouting what we imagine was a long, desperate string of profanities, Soanes prepared for life-saving open-heart surgery. But much to his surprise, and everyone else's, for that matter, the patient's heartbeat just kept chugging along. At this point, we assume Soanes just pretended he did it on purpose, smoothed his hair, and strutted out of the operating room like the Fonz. Through further experimentation, scientists discovered that fears of blockages were overblown, and most patients could, indeed, manage a large amount of dye pushed through their arteries, leading directly to the invention of the coronary angiogram. Eeeeee! While working as a medical researcher in the 1950s, Wilson Greatbatch, whose last name sounds like a compliment you'd give someone's cookies, was putting together an oscillator when he reached into his toolbox and pulled out the wrong kind of resistor. He installed it into the oscillator without realizing, only to discover that it made the machine emit a rhythmic electrical pulse, giving Greatbatch the idea of a lifetime. No, it wasn't, I should keep my toolbox a little more organized. He had accidentally invented a better version of the pacemaker. Before his invention, pacemakers were enormous and unpleasant, capable of saving lives, but not doing much to improve a patient's quality of life. Greatbatch created a much smaller version of the device, and after a successful trial period, it didn't take long for their use to become mainstream. Today, implantable pacemakers have greatly extended the lives of millions of individuals. But history remains unclear on whether Greatbatch made a mean chocolate chip cookie. If you were out of work, where would you hang out? If your answer is in an oil field, then congratulations. You have something in common with the inventor of Vaseline. In 1859, unemployed chemist Robert Chisbro, whose last name is too silly to even joke about, was visiting an oil field when he heard complaints about something called rod wax. It sounds like something you'd buy from a store in the mall that sells airbrushed t-shirts, but it's actually a residue that builds up in pumps and needs to be periodically removed to prevent jamming. Chisbro also learned that rig workers had taken to collecting the jelly-like substance and applying it to their cuts and burns, reporting a soothing sensation. And that's all Chisbro needed to hear. Over the next decade, he worked on extracting and purifying this petroleum jelly until he was left with a product suitable for the open market. The result was Vaseline, and Chisbro spent the rest of his life extolling its medical virtues, reportedly going as far as to eat a spoonful of it a day himself, which we do not recommend you do. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen was performing an experiment in Würzburg, Bavaria, which we are assuming has the best beer and pretzels in the entire world. The experiment itself was pretty mundane, but the results he achieved were anything but. Röntgen was attempting to find out if cathode rays could pass through glass. So he covered a cathode tube with heavy black paper and waited to see what would happen. And without a smartphone to pass the time. We used to have so much patience. An unnatural green light began to emanate from within. It emerged through the paper and projected onto a nearby fluorescent screen. And that surprising result gave Röntgen an idea. He discovered that some of the rays he produced could pass through just about anything. But they also left shadows of solid objects wherever they were projected. Because he didn't know what these specific rays were, he labeled them X-rays. The name was so catchy, no one ever bothered to change it. The discovery of penicillin is perhaps the most famous tale of accidental medical innovation in history, even if the commonly told version of that tale is more or less a fish story. The usual version holds that microbiologist Alexander Fleming left a sandwich sitting in a lab while on vacation, only to return and find it molded over with a life-saving substance. While that's not far from the truth, it's also not completely true. Still with us? Good. Fleming did go on vacation in 1928, and he did leave some items out in the lab. But they were petri dishes filled with colonies of Staphylococcus, which we don't recommend adding to your sandwich. When he returned, one dish had grown moldy in his absence. And that's when he made the discovery of a lifetime. The area of the dish affected by the mold, which Fleming later identified as penicillin notatum, was free of the staphylococcus, as if something in the mold itself was inhibiting the growth and spread of the bacteria. Soon enough, Fleming was able to prove that's exactly what was happening. As a result, penicillin is now the most widely used antibiotic in the world. Score one for having a dirty workstation. The Pap smear is one of the simplest procedures in modern medicine, yet one of the most vital for women's health. It all stems from one doctor, George Papanicolaou, and his research into the menstrual cycle. At first, Papanicolaou only intended to swab his test subjects to determine how their vaginal cells changed at different stages of sexual development. But when he noticed cancer cells in one such swab, the focus of his research shifted. While it was undoubtedly bad news for the patient, Papanicolaou discovered that this simple, inexpensive procedure provided the earliest possible indications of cervical cancer in patients. In doing so, Papanicolaou undoubtedly saved countless lives, and today the method still bears his name, or rather a shortened version of his name. No one wants to have to ask for a Papanicolaou smear. In the early 1990s, researchers at Pfizer were looking into a substance known as sildenafil as a potential treatment for high blood pressure. They believed it might be able to dilate the heart's blood vessels by blocking a certain protein. When initial tests looked promising, they moved on to human trials, which yielded disappointing results, though not for long. Nurses examining test subjects noticed that the men who had ingested the substance were often lying on their stomachs when they came into the room to check on them. One nurse quickly figured out that the men were embarrassed by their uncontrollable erections, which turned out to be an unforeseen side effect of sildenafil. At least none of them started levitating. Having accidentally invented a particularly important drug for men, we imagine those researchers threw one heck of a party, or at least took the rest of the day off. They abandoned the whole high blood pressure angle, and today the drug is sold under the name Viagra. In 1938, researcher Albert Hofmann began artificially synthesizing ergot fungus compounds into lysergic acid and mixing them with other active ingredients. He was searching for a substance that might be able to stimulate the respiratory and circulatory systems to treat hemorrhaging, and was in no way trying to figure out a way to get the Beatles to eventually write Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But hey, if it happens, it happens. On his 20th attempt, Hofmann combined lysergic acid with diethylamine, which showed some intriguing results. He labeled this concoction LSD-25. And despite moving on to other potential solutions, Hofmann kept thinking of the strange and excited reaction that lab animals had experienced after being exposed to number 25. So, 5 years later, he returned to experimenting with it. And by experimenting with it, we mean accidentally exposing himself to it. After this inadvertent dosage, Hofmann wrote that he had to leave work early and go home because he was being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. Once home, the chemist laid down and fell into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. Hofmann recalled being in a dreamlike state. The sun hurt his eyes, so he kept them closed, during which time he perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with an intense kaleidoscope play of colors. This was a much more eloquent way of stating, I was tripping balls. And with that, one of the world's most popular hallucinogens, along with every note of music ever played by the Grateful Dead, was born. It's not a stretch to say that no medical discovery has had a greater impact than the mechanism behind vaccinations. But the discovery didn't come from a lab or a university. Rather, it came from an ordinary farm and the musings of a milkmaid. Thankfully, no one involved was lactose intolerant. When Edward Jenner was just a teenager in the 1760s, a woman told him, I shall never have smallpox, for I've had cowpox. I shall never have an ugly pockmarked face. It was a super weird thing to say to a teenager, but it stuck with him. And good thing, too, because that teenager eventually grew up into a doctor. But it wasn't until 1796, after a lengthy career as a medical researcher, that Jenner finally applied this knowledge. He found another milkmaid, Sarah Nelms, who had been freshly infected with cowpox, and used material from her lesions to inoculate a young boy. When the boy subsequently proved immune to smallpox, the era of vaccines had officially begun, and the source of smallpox was well on its way to being eliminated. He wasn't the first person in history to experiment with inoculation, but Jenner is the most noteworthy. and today he is widely recognized as the originator of vaccines. So, the next time some weirdo says something strange to you at the mall, write that stuff down. Who knows what you'll invent? The chemical compound coumarin, produced naturally by moldy hay, leads to an animal disease known as sweet clover disease, which is nowhere near as cute as it sounds. Back in the day, scientists turned a variation of coumarin, called warfarin, into a particularly potent rodenticide. Then, in 1951, a U.S. Army trainee attempted to take his own life using that rat toxin. Miraculously, he survived the attempt. His survival inspired researchers to start looking into warfarin's potential as an anticoagulant, and they found it to be far more effective at treating and preventing blood clots than other blood thinners on the market. By 1954, it was already approved for human use, and by 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was using it. And if Ike likes it, then we like it. Biosphere 2 ended its life as a pop culture punchline, inspiring the Pauly Shore comedy Biodome, a few nostalgic "Hey, remember that?" docuseries, and decades of comedy sketches. But before its very public and embarrassing failure, the Biosphere started out as a real and somewhat legitimate science project, attempting to learn how humans might survive in extraterrestrial environments. Today, we're uncovering some unbelievable facts about Biosphere 2, the largest contained experiment ever. Okay, time to cause some trouble in the bubble. The Biosphere 2 story starts with the meeting of two men in the 1970s at a New Mexico counterculture eco-community known as Synergia Ranch. The place was founded by an ecologist, engineer, metallurgist, and self-described adventurer named John P. Allen, who also wrote poetry and stories under the pen name Johnny Dolphin. And while we can't say for certain whether any mind-altering substances were involved, come on, you don't spend the weekend at Johnny Dolphin's Eco Ranch sober. The ranch was dedicated to a number of environmental projects and experiments, including sustainable agriculture systems, soil development, solar and wind energy, and anti-desertification. There were also fruit and vegetable gardens, over 1,000 trees, and a geodesic dome designed by Buckminster Fuller. Although that's not really that unique. Old Buckminster was a little dome crazy in those days and was just throwing them up everywhere. If your house was built before 1970, you may have one in your backyard. It was at Synergia Ranch that Johnny Dolphin, aka John Allen, met Ed Bass, a businessman and philanthropist who had inherited an oil fortune from his family and was passionate about environmental issues, but not in the direction of most oil tycoons. Bass was passionate about protecting the environment. Both Bass and Allen were interested in writer Buckminster Fuller's ideas regarding what he called Spaceship Earth, and the notion of designing advanced refuges and bunkers that could protect the last scraps of humanity from extinction-level events, like nuclear war. There are some suggestions that Allen's ideas went a little bit farther than reputable science. Prior to Synergia Ranch, he'd worked with an Arizona theater troupe called the Caravan of Dreams that just may have ultimately morphed into something closer to an apocalyptic doomsday cult. In many of his writings as Johnny Dolphin, Allen developed these ideas, writing about Earth's impending doom and how the secret to humanity's survival lay in space exploration and Martian colonization. He may not be wrong about that. After all, time will tell. In 1984, Bass and Allen, along with several veterans of Caravan of Dreams and the Synergia Ranch community, started work on a new project, which they called Biosphere 2. The name is a little confusing because it sounds like Biosphere 2 was the long-awaited sequel to a previous project, but it's not. The Earth itself is Biosphere 1, so you can see what they were trying to go for there. Maybe it's a sequel. The concept was to create an artificial, materially closed ecological system where researchers and scientists could develop strategies to support and maintain an ongoing human society in outer space. Different areas of the project would be designed as individual biomes to support different kinds of research and life, including living areas for humans, farms, coral reefs, a savanna grassland, a rainforest, a fog desert, scientific laboratories, a water park, and so on. Ultimately, the hope was that these experiments would help scientists in the future develop systems for colonizing space. Biosphere 2 was constructed between 1987 and 1991 in Oracle, Arizona, at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, around an hour outside of Tucson. The above-ground structure was made of steel tubing and frames, along with high-performance glass, which sounds like glass that's really good at basketball, but is really just glass that doesn't let as much heat in. Due to the closed-off nature of the experiments, these windows required a nearly airtight seal, which meant the biosphere gradually lost oxygen over time and required a sophisticated system to regulate its internal temperature. The first Biosphere 2 mission started on September 26, 1991, and ran for exactly 2 years. 8 scientists, known as bionauts, lived and worked within the facility, while being closely monitored by Mission Control. For the launch event, they wore identical red Star Trek-like jumpsuits that were actually custom designed for them by Marilyn Monroe's former dressmaker. Hey, just because it's science doesn't mean they can't drip. The majority of the bionauts' diet came from their internal agricultural system, which included crops like sweet potatoes, bananas, papayas, beans, rice, and wheat. Whoa, hopefully they didn't install low-flow toilets. On-site medic Dr. Roy Walford had spent several decades of his life researching longevity and strategies to extend the aging process, and he'd become convinced through studies of mice populations that a healthy, low-calorie diet was the key. He personally designed a diet that he believed would keep people alive for up to 120 years, and he tested some of his theories out on fellow bionauts. There's nothing more relaxing than being locked in a terrarium for 2 years with a doctor who wants you to try his mice diet. As it turned out, Walford might as well have told them to eat nothing but used coffee filters. The participants all reported continual hunger from their low-calorie, nutrient-rich diets, and they lost an average of 16% of their total body weight in their first year inside the biosphere. Side effects of the dramatic weight loss included sluggishness, mental fatigue, and even food theft over time. Some bionauts also observed that their skin developed an orange glow from consuming so many foods that are high in beta-carotene, like carrots and sweet potatoes. The clinical term for this condition is Muppet skin. It's also believed that the meager rations and near starvation were the cause for some of the infighting and psychological issues that plagued the group. By the halfway point in the first Biosphere mission, the researchers had split into 2 bitterly opposed factions. One group felt that it was important to keep the biosphere completely closed from any outside elements, while the other felt that the success of the individual experiments and research projects themselves should be the top priority. By November of 1992, members of one group began eating seed stocks that had not been originally grown within the biosphere, a breach of the experiment's protocol. They were ordered to leave the facility, but they refused, pointing out that their expulsion would effectively make the entire experiment a bust. The situation got so bad, Mission Control actually brought in a psychologist to evaluate the researchers, who concluded that it was just a relatively sane power struggle and there was no immediate need to intervene. You know, a perfectly normal gang war between scientists locked in a geodesic dome. Pretty standard stuff. Some of the physical conditions within the dome may have contributed to the breakdown of the research team. The steady loss of oxygen in the atmosphere became a major issue, causing some of the scientists to develop symptoms like sleep apnea and fatigue. Furthermore, while a number of insect species died out quickly, the population of greenhouse ants and cockroaches exploded, threatening biodiversity throughout the facility and effectively transforming the lofty biosphere into the dumpster behind a Pizza Hut. Roaches in particular became such a significant problem, the crew was forced to get creative. They started baiting coffee cups with a bit of papaya at the bottom, and then greasing the sides with KY jelly. It's unclear why they had that. The researchers would wake up in the morning and grind up the captured roaches to use as chicken feed. Hopefully, they washed the cups after that. These weren't the only wrinkles in the Biosphere experiment as originally planned either. The total isolation of the bionauts from the rest of civilization was a key component of the experiment. After all, if you're going to simulate a human colony in space, you can't just pop down to the Piggly Wiggly after the ants steal the last Slim Jim for their horrible queen. They don't have Piggly Wigglies on Mars. It's more of a Wawa town. So, the entire biosphere was expected to run entirely self-sufficiently for the full 2-year program. But around 8 months into the experiment, one of the researchers, Jane Pointer, sliced off the tip of her finger during a cooking accident. The on-site medical officer tried to sew the fingertip back on, but it shriveled up and turned black, which is generally a bad sign. Mission Control decided she needed outside medical attention. But upon returning to the biosphere after 2 days, Pointer brought 2 mysterious duffel bags back into the facility with her. To this day, we don't know what kind of extra supplies she brought in. Our money's on beer. But whatever they were, they contaminated the entire 2-year experiment. Undaunted, the team behind Space Biosphere Ventures planned to take everything they'd learned from the first Biosphere mission and try again. A second Biosphere 2 mission launched on March 6, 1994, with a shorter span of just 10 months. Soon after the new team of bionauts entered the facility, though, a dispute led to the dissolution of the company's management team. Ed Bass brought in a new manager to run Space Biosphere Ventures by the name of Steve Bannon, the same Steve Bannon who would later briefly serve as White House chief strategist under Donald Trump. At the time, he was running Bannon & Company, a Beverly Hills investment banking firm. Because of his background, a number of members of the Biosphere team believed that he was there to make money rather than advance the cause of science. They feared he would jeopardize the project and possibly even the safety of the scientists living inside. So on April 5th, two members of the original Biosphere team, Abigail Alling and Mark Van Thillo, allegedly intervened directly, opening a double airlock door and 3 emergency exits and leaving them open for 15 minutes. This was considered to be against the spirit of the experiment because you cannot leave doors open in outer space. Alling told the Chicago Tribune that she considered the project to be in an emergency state and that she felt it was her responsibility to protect the safety of the participants by giving them the option to leave. This is notably also not a thing you can do in space. 4 days later, Biosphere Chief Executive Margaret Augustine was suspended, and her husband, bionaut Norberto Alvarez Romo, exited the facility, citing a family emergency. Although the project continued struggling along until September, this essentially marked the end of the experiment. Space Biospheres Ventures was dissolved on June 1st, while there were still scientists living in the sphere. Bannon ultimately walked away from the company and was sued for abusive process by some of the former crew members, including Abigail Alling. Ultimately, the plaintiffs won, and Space Biosphere Ventures had to pay them $600,000. While that was the end of the Biosphere experiments, scientists continued picking through the research over the decades that followed to see if they'd maybe accidentally managed to produce some valuable insight. A special issue of the journal Ecological Engineering, published in 1999, gathers together research and findings from the project and includes a lot of data about the system metabolism, heat and humidity levels, the health of the various biomes, and more. Though this write-up has informed several scientific papers and writings that followed, it's still incomplete. In fact, much of the original data gathered by the Biosphere 2 team has never been fully analyzed, and much of it is now believed to be lost. Those roaches, they probably took it. Known for revolutionizing chemistry and conducting groundbreaking experiments during the Enlightenment, Antoine Lavoisier and his wife Marie-Anne are today known as the father and mother of modern chemistry. Antoine also revolutionized French gunpowder, which helped his country win wars and even aided in the American Revolution. But during the bloodiest days of the French Revolution, none of that would help him. Today, we're going to take a look at how the father and mother of modern chemistry were utterly destroyed by the French Revolution. Okay, while the revolution may not have been televised, we've got you covered. Most people have heard of Marie and Pierre Curie, the scientific couple who, among other things, discovered radium. But Antoine and Marie-Anne Lavoisier were the OG science power couple. In the 18th century, Antoine led the chemical revolution, established the law of conservation of mass, and named several elements, including oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. Together, the Lavoisiers worked to build on Joseph Priestley's groundbreaking research on oxygen and promote a lab-based approach to chemistry. However, the Lavoisiers were also aristocrats, and Antoine was a former tax collector, which was not a great thing to be during the French Revolution. Unfortunately, when the Reign of Terror turned its sights on Antoine, his cutting-edge scientific achievements couldn't protect him. During the 1700s, most scientists believed in the phlogiston theory, which, long story short, supposedly explained why things burn. Antoine Lavoisier disagreed with the concept and argued that the so-called dephlogisticated air was really what his acquaintance and rival Joseph Priestley had identified as oxygen. The friendly rivalry between Priestley and Lavoisier produced volumes of correspondence detailing their findings. History credits both Priestley and Lavoisier for discovering oxygen, though Priestley believed he had found dephlogisticated air. It was actually Antoine who identified the gas and gave it the name oxygen, which was derived from the Greek word for acid maker. Antoine Lavoisier is highly renowned for the elements he named, as well as the law of conservation of mass. During the chemical revolution, Antoine argued that elements of set weights comprised the world, and he tested that theory in 1772 by burning a diamond. How did that work? Well, during the experiment, Antoine placed a diamond in a sealed jar and focused light on it using an enormous magnifying glass. The diamond burned and seemed to disappear completely, yet Antoine found the weight of the jar and its contents had not changed. He used this result to demonstrate how mass conservation is a law of nature. In later tests, Antoine determined that a burning diamond and charcoal produced the same gas, carbon dioxide. The discovery convinced him that both diamond and charcoal contained the same element, which he named carbon. As if discovering and naming oxygen and carbon weren't enough, the Lavoisiers also spent years of research exploring the nature of respiration and combustion. It paid off. Ultimately, they proved that, from a chemical standpoint, the two processes were actually identical. They did this by designing several tests to measure breathing and the heat given off during respiration. In one experiment, for example, Antoine used his laboratory tools to measure the heat and carbon dioxide emitted from a guinea pig's exhalation. He then burned carbon to produce an equal amount of carbon dioxide to prove it created the same amount of heat. This revolutionary research explained why mammals have a body temperature higher than room temperature. Antoine Lavoisier's scientific research was invaluable to the chemistry community. But scientists weren't the only ones to benefit. It also helped the French army. In 1775, Antoine joined the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Administration, a research group dedicated to augmenting gunpowder. As a commissioner, Antoine created a laboratory to study gunpowder's constituent parts. Antoine worked with potassium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal to enhance gunpowder, and his tests revealed a better way to granulate the powder. The project, which was initially started by King Louis XVI because he was concerned that France wasn't self-sufficient in the manufacture of gunpowder, was such a success that the country soon had excess quantities of gunpowder available for export. Interestingly, one of the major beneficiaries of this surplus would be the soldiers in George Washington's army, who were busy fighting the American Revolution. The Lavoisiers were only able to revolutionize chemistry because of their advanced equipment, and they only had the equipment because in 1783, Antoine had designated Jean-Nicolas Fortin as his instrument maker. The couple needed the best tools to conduct precise chemical experiments, and Fortin, who also worked with French innovators like Pierre Dulong and Gay-Lussac, was experienced at designing gear for scientists. In his most famous work, Elements of Chemistry, Antoine included detailed drawings showing 170 different pieces of laboratory devices. Marie-Anne had drawn each diagram to scale, showing the flasks, furnaces, and jars the pair used to uncover new scientific principles. Marie-Anne Pierrette Pauls was only 13 when she married the 28-year-old Antoine Lavoisier. That seems very young, but then again, it was a very different time. If it makes you feel any better, Antoine's biographer, Douglas Mackay, said that the marriage was a happy one, in part because Marie-Anne became Antoine's most important scientific collaborator. According to Mackay, Marie-Anne was possessed of a high intelligence. She took a great interest in her husband's scientific work and rapidly equipped herself to share in his labors. Mackay further states that Marie-Anne helped Antoine in the laboratory and drew sketches of his experiments. On top of all that, she made many of the entries in his laboratory notebooks. Marie-Anne also learned English so she could translate and comment on the latest research reports from Britain and engage with scientific contemporaries. If treating her as an intellectual partner and a professional equal isn't enough to ease your mind about the significant age gap, know that Antoine only originally agreed to marry the teenage Marie-Anne so she wouldn't have to marry someone more than 3 times her age. In 1771, the Count d'Amerval, a middle-aged man, threatened to fire Marie-Anne's father from his tax company if he could not marry Marie-Anne, something that seems like it should be illegal, but at the time it wasn't. Marie-Anne's father needed a reason to refuse the powerful aristocrat, so he asked his associate, Antoine, to marry Marie-Anne instead. Antoine and Marie-Anne wed in 1771 and remained together until Antoine's death during the French Revolution. Given that they were dedicated scientist types, the Lavoisiers often spent their days in the laboratory. Antoine was typically the one directing experiments, while Marie-Anne managed the schedule and recorded the results. Madame Lavoisier wrote that her husband believed any day in the lab was a good one. According to her, it was for him a day of happiness. She described how much her husband loved going to the lab in the mornings, to meet with some friends who shared his views and some young men proud to be admitted to the honor of collaborating in his experiments. Antoine was often at the center of the conversations, as his wife recalled. It was there that you could have heard this man with his precise mind, his clear intelligence, his high genius, the loftiness of his philosophical principles, illuminating his conversation. Antoine Lavoisier's groundbreaking book, Elements of Chemistry, debuted in 1789, which unfortunately was the same year the French Revolution turned his country upside down. The Lavoisiers initially supported the revolution, and Antoine worked with a new government to establish the metric system across France. But Antoine also acknowledged that the disruption affected his work, and in 1790 he wrote that the state of public affairs in France has temporarily retarded the progress of science and distracted scientists from the work that is most precious to them. He didn't know when he wrote that, but being distracted was going to quickly become the least of his concerns. Only a few years later, Antoine received a death warrant with his name on it. For centuries, people across Europe hated tax collectors, which isn't too hard to believe because who likes a tax collector, even now? But France's financial problems compelled citizens to particularly despise them in the years before the French Revolution. The French tax system protected the elite from taxes and levied most of the burden on the Third Estate, which was comprised of peasants, merchants, and artisans. The collection system rested on using tax farmers, and some extorted their districts to keep the excess for themselves. Antoine Lavoisier had once served as a tax collector, and though his wife wasn't one, she was the daughter of one, and that certainly didn't help the couple's popularity. As the French Revolution grew more radical, many people began to view all aristocrats with suspicion. In 1793, at the dawn of the Reign of Terror, the revolutionaries disbanded the French Academy of Sciences, the most important scientific society in the country. 2 years earlier, members of the Academy, including Antoine Lavoisier, had helped create the metric system for France. But the revolutionaries declared the Academy elitist. Talk about being ungrateful. In 1794, the revolutionary government declared Antoine a traitor. He faced accusations of conspiring with foreign scientists and sending money to France's enemies. The government issued his death warrant. It probably didn't make him feel any better about being executed, but the Reign of Terror didn't single out Antoine Lavoisier. In fact, the government arrested anyone and everyone who participated in the tax collecting group, including Marie-Anne's father. On May 8, 1794, a revolutionary tribunal convicted Antoine of conspiracy against the people of France. The revolutionaries did not wait long to carry out the death sentence. Hours later, Antoine found himself staring down the national razor. He was 50 years old when he died. They also executed Marie-Anne's father that day. It was a rough day all around. After his execution, Antoine Lavoisier was mourned by scientists around the world. To drive home how irreplaceable Antoine was, mathematician Joseph-Louis Lagrange said of the execution, "It took them only an instant to cut off that head, and 100 years may not produce another like it." Marie-Anne continued to promote her husband's work. She published his papers in 1805, and after the Reign of Terror was over, she hosted a scientific salon in Paris. She even went on to marry another scientist, Benjamin Thompson. Just a year after executing Antoine, the French government voided the trial and declared the scientist innocent. Antoine was only one of the thousands who died during the French Revolution, but his story is one of the most tragic. Most people know that the Victorian era, which spanned from 1837 to 1901, was a great time for industrialization, science, and economic prosperity. But few realize the 19th century also saw many important discoveries and developments in the world of criminal forensics that created a blueprint for modern-day investigations. So, today we're going to take a look at some fascinating Victorian attempts at forensic investigation. Okay, someone call William Peterson because it's time for some Victorian CSI. In 1788, German anatomist Johann Christoph Andreas Meyer became the first scientist to suggest that fingerprints are unique to each individual. But the implications of this insight must not have been immediately apparent, because it wasn't until the late 19th century that someone thought to apply the principle to criminal investigations. That someone was a doctor named Robert Blake Overton, who wrote to Scotland Yard in 1840, suggesting the detectives there try and use fingerprint evidence to catch the murder of Lloyd William Russell. The investigators were willing to hear him out, but Overton was apparently a little too ahead of his time. Fingerprinting evidence wouldn't become a routine part of investigations for another 50 years, give or take a few years. In 1880, physician Henry Faulds published a paper in the scientific journal Nature, again suggesting that fingerprints left at a crime scene could be used for the scientific identification of criminals. The matter still wasn't seriously considered by police, though. In fact, it wasn't until the 1890s when Sir Francis Galton developed a classification of fingerprint patterns for police analysis that fingerprinting evidence would finally be put to use. Fingerprints were then adopted as a means to identify criminals. In 1892, Francisco Rojas, who killed her 2 children in Argentina, would become the first person in the world ever caught due to fingerprints being left behind at a crime scene. And in 1902, Harry Jackson, who stole a set of billiard balls, was the first man in the United Kingdom convicted on fingerprint evidence. Of course, London was never completely devoid of violent criminals, but after Jack the Ripper became one of the first high-profile serial killers of the mass media age, people took notice of such crimes in a big way. Prior to Jack, crime in the Victorian era was perceived to be mostly petty offenses or revenge crimes. Things like robberies, garroting, prostitution, and drunken disorderly charges were the norm, while sadistic serial killers weren't even on the cultural radar. Criminals of the time were often perceived merely as lazy, lower-class citizens looking to make a quick buck. But once Jack the Ripper began brutally carving up his victims, that perception changed fast. Desperate to catch the Ripper, the police found themselves willing to try out some new ideas, and the first criminal profile was created as an attempt to understand this new type of monster. The first person to profile a criminal was named Bond, Thomas Bond. We'd love to be able to say he was on Her Majesty's Secret Service, but he was actually a surgeon with the Metropolitan Police. After examining the evidence, Bond concluded that Jack the Ripper was a man subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, quite likely to be a quiet, inoffensive-looking man, probably middle-aged and neatly and respectably dressed. Bond also believed Jack would probably be solitary and eccentric in his habits. He also is most likely to be a man without regular occupation, but with some small income or pension. Since the Ripper was never caught, we'll never know how accurate Bond's profile was. What we do know, however, is that criminal profiling would go on to become a standard tool of law enforcement. Authorities have long used microscopic analysis to study hairs and fibers left at crime scenes. Rudolf Virchow conducted the first forensic human hair comparison way back in 1861, finding that the hairs on the case's defendant matched, by all indications, hair found on the victim. However, despite the similarity in appearance, the hairs could never be considered unique to an individual. While forensic hair analysis in the Victorian era followed that understanding, microscopic examination of hairs and fibers were still often used in criminal proceedings. Comparative evidence of hairs, however, had limited use. While hair could be used as circumstantial evidence, or to give further information on the criminal's age or sex, it could never be considered an absolute definitive match. It could still be pretty effective, though. For example, in the 1863 case of Reg v. Steed, the perpetrator stomped on the victim's head, killing him. There were hairs lodged on the bottom of the boot of the accused, which matched hairs from the deceased. The victim was wearing a red neck scarf, and investigators also found red fibers on the bottom of the perpetrator's boot. The hair and fiber comparison helped secure a conviction. Early analysis of bullets was rudimentary. Since guns were not yet mass-produced, comparisons between bullets and the guns that fired them could often be made by eye. For example, in 1835, Henry Goddard, a member of the London Bow Street Runners, was able to identify a gun used in a murder based on a slight defect in the discharged bullet. As the mass production of firearms began to take off, however, identifying bullets with the naked eye was no longer a feasible option. Investigators had to begin using microscopes to see the bullets more clearly. They also developed techniques like rolling the bullets onto inked paper to search for any identifying marks. The new methods meant that ballistic analysis could be considered more than just a shot in the dark. While medical experts often testified in criminal cases prior to the 19th century, their testimony was not accompanied by an autopsy. In fact, it seems surprising by today's standards, but those experts typically didn't make any formal examination of the body at all. Seeing the problem of inaccurate medical testimony, surgeon and coroner Thomas Wakely began to push for a required post-mortem in suspicious deaths. Eventually, the Medical Witness Act of 1836 allowed coroners to conduct autopsies when deemed necessary and encouraged testimony from medical experts. While autopsies were conducted more frequently, they still were not the norm due to cultural concerns about cutting open a dead body. By the time of England's infamous Whitechapel murders, however, autopsies had come a long way. Medical examiners used body cooling and rigor mortis to approximate the time of death. They also conducted much more thorough and standardized autopsies of victims. However, despite the advances, these procedures were still primitive in a lot of ways. The post-mortem examinations were often held in sheds, makeshift morgues, or even the house where the victim died. Doctors didn't give hygiene and sterilization much consideration. They believed that rubber gloves dulled the surgeon's sense of touch. Poisoning was a popular method of murdering people during the 19th century. This isn't too hard to believe since the prevalence of chemist shops made poison easily accessible, and it was well known that autopsies of victims were often inconclusive. Many victims appeared to have died of natural causes, so if you wanted to kill someone, poisoning was definitely the way to go. Scientists did slowly begin to chip away at the problem, though. For example, in 1836, chemist Marsh developed the Marsh test, which allowed doctors to test human tissue for the presence of arsenic. This development led to the convictions of many murderers during the Victorian era, including Sarah Daisley, nicknamed the Potton Poisoner. Authorities suspected Daisley of murdering her first husband and son. She was eventually convicted of murdering her second husband after his body was exhumed for a Marsh test. It wasn't until the early 1900s that scientists developed a universal test for the presence of blood, but Victorian investigators examined blood long before that. In fact, Professor Matthew Orfila began examining bodily fluids microscopically and developing tests to distinguish these substances in the early 1800s. In 1873, English medical writer and toxicologist Alfred Swain Taylor described 3 methods for examining bloodstains. Taylor developed processes for chemical, microscopic, and optical investigation. He provided instructions on how these methods could positively identify human blood and distinguish it from similar substances such as dyes and paints. Furthermore, he discussed using the analysis of blood splatter to indicate the time and manner of death. In the infamous case of the Road murder, 16-year-old Constance Kent confessed to killing her 4-year-old brother by slashing his throat with a razor blade. Swain and the medical examiner suggested that because there was little blood at the crime scene, despite the victim's throat being cut, the child died from previous injuries, such as strangulation, before the perpetrator slashed his throat. They concluded that Kent's confession was likely false, and she was probably covering for another family member. We'd like to say this story ended happily ever after for Constance, but sadly, she was convicted nonetheless. If you watched Weird History's video about how people in the Victorian era spent their free time, then you already know that people from that time were well versed in taking photos of the deceased. That being said, most of these mourning photographs, as they were known, were taken for personal reasons. However, while crime scene photography was conceptualized during the late 1800s, it was not often employed. It seems obvious to us now, but taking crime scene photos didn't even start becoming a standard practice until Alfred Swain Taylor wrote his 1865 book, The Principles and Practice of Medical Jurisprudence. In that book, Taylor opined, "It would be well if, before a body is moved, a photograph could be taken of the attitude and position of surrounding objects in relation to it." In some cases, investigators brought photographers in to document a specific blood splatter pattern or the state of the victim. But in general, crime scene photography still wasn't regularly utilized at the time Jack the Ripper struck in the 1880s. In fact, there are only photos of one Ripper victim, Mary Kelly. The bodies and scenes were generally cleared as quickly as possible to prevent public hysteria. It wasn't until the turn of the century that investigators started to agree upon the importance of crime scene photography. While many of the forensic innovations of the Victorian era turned out to be breakthroughs that forever changed how investigations are conducted, some of them didn't quite pan out. For example, when investigators photographed Jack the Ripper's victim Mary Kelly, the main focus was her eyes. Why the eyes? Well, according to Inspector Walter Dew, photographers captured Kelly's eyes in the hopes that perhaps a lasting image of the killer was preserved on her retinas. Needless to say, eyes don't work like that, and the photos didn't help identify the killer. Luckily, proponents of crime scene photography pressed on about its usefulness, and in 1888, the Metropolitan and London police began photographing victims' faces as means of identifying the deceased, rather than their eyes to try and identify the killers. The Whitechapel murders marked another first in that journalists published a sketch of the man suspected to be Jack the Ripper. Witnesses had seen the assailant in the vicinity of the crime scenes, so actual descriptions did influence the sketch. However, the ultimate value of the final drawing was highly questionable, since the artist also added his own thoughts of how an evil murderer like Jack the Ripper might look. Despite these early exercises in artistic license, police sketches based on eyewitness descriptions of suspects became a common tool of investigations and are still frequently employed by the crime solvers of today. Remember the bog of eternal stench from Labyrinth, where if you fall into it, you smell horrible for the rest of your life? That sounds pretty bad. But falling into a real-life bog can result in your body being perfectly preserved for thousands of years. So future people can discover and do all kinds of weird experiments on you to figure out what life was like back in your time. And, that ain't entirely pleasant either. So, today we're digging into the tale of the Talland Man, the 2,400-year-old bog body. All right, everyone, bogs away! Our story starts in May of 1950 with a pair of peat cutters in a bog outside Silkeborg, Denmark. Back then, peat was an important fuel source, particularly for heating homes and cooking. In the spring months, it was harvested around bogs with specialized tools. While gathering some peat, brothers Viggo and Emil Højgaard came upon what looked like a freshly felled corpse. A boy from Copenhagen had recently gone missing in the area, and the brothers contacted authorities, grimly assuming they had found the child's remains. But it soon became clear to the police that the body had not been placed in the bog all that recently. For one thing, it was buried deep under 8 feet of peat moss, with no external signs of the surrounding ground having been freshly dug. Representatives of the local Silkeborg Museum, along with other scientific experts, including Danish archaeologist Peter P.V. Gloop, were called into the scene. What the brothers actually found were the surprisingly well-preserved remains of a man who lived in the area during the pre-Roman Iron Age, likely around the year 400 BCE. The find was ultimately named the Talland Man, after the nearby village of Talland, although some newspapers suggested the Man from Bogville, which is very colorful, but ultimately didn't stick, unlike the peat in which he had been found. Oh, they should have named him Pete. So, how did the body look so fresh after being there for so long? Well, in addition to various swamp things, the ground beneath bogs contains little oxygen, which does not allow for a lot of bacterial growth. Additionally, a common plant in bog moss known as sphagnum releases biomolecules called polysaccharides when it dies, which also stops bacteria from growing and spreading. That means organic materials such as, well, human remains, doesn't degrade when buried under a bog the way they would in normal dirt. Bogs could almost be described as curing human bodies, a process similar in some ways to tanning. The beef jerky kind, not the banana boat kind. Though the skin gets almost perfectly preserved, the rest of the corpse, like bones and organs, degrades at a faster rate over time, resulting in the corpse shrinking and distorting, kind of like the guy who drank from the wrong cup in The Last Crusade, but less fun. The process of safely transporting the Talland Man to the National Museum in Copenhagen, where it could be studied, proved difficult. The dirt was dug away from around the body. Then a large wooden crate was assembled around the entire specimen, with the bottom box pushed through a thick layer of peat underneath the corpse. The box containing both dirt and the taloned man weighed around a half-ton and was ferried to a nearby train station by horse-drawn carriage. It was an extremely old-timey way to travel. Once back in Copenhagen, scientists determined that the taloned man was likely around 40 years old when he perished. But he did not pass away from natural causes. A noose made of animal hide was found around his neck and trailing down his back, indicating that he was hung. His tongue was also distended, a common sign of having died by strangulation. No historical record has ever been found concerning such an execution, so historians and scholars are left to guess the specifics of how the taloned man met his end. It's possible he was a criminal whose hanging was meant as punishment, but some, including P.V. Glope and British archaeologist Miranda Aldhouse Green, have suggested an alternate theory. The placement of the body in the fetal position suggests that the taloned man may have been a human sacrifice, perhaps to a fertility goddess. Iron Age Scandinavia was a pagan society, and bogs and wetlands were seen as particularly spiritual locations in Germanic paganism, with religious rites and practices conducted there. Plus, a number of ancient Roman historians reported that human sacrifice was practiced by the people of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. However, these accounts were written by outsiders, many of whom were inclined to depict non-Roman or pre-Christian societies as savage or barbaric, so they can't be entirely trusted. Only the bog knows for certain. The taloned man was found hanged, with his hair cut very short, entirely naked except for a skin cap and leather belt. Still, he got off easy compared to some of his fellow bog discoveries. A corpse known as the Lindau man perished near Cheshire, England, in 60 AD from a sharp blow to the head that fractured his skull. After that, he was strangled and slashed with a knife before being kicked into the bog. So Mr. Lindau wasn't exactly popular in life. Other bog bodies appear to have been the victims of ritual humiliations, like having their heads shaved or their arms mounted on wooden branches driven through the wounds. There was even one body discovered that was nothing but a torso, known as Old Croghan Man. If Clive Barker's watching, he's taking notes for the next Hellraiser movie. But then there's the facial expression of the taloned man himself. Rather than looking scared or traumatized by what's happening to him, he appears calm and accepting. P.V. Glope remarked that he had a gentle expression, as if in silent prayer. In the 1970s, Irish poet Seamus Heaney was so moved by photographs of the peaceful faces of the taloned man and other bog bodies, he wrote a cycle of poems about them, comparing their ancient fates to the ethno-nationalist violence known as the Troubles. So perhaps the taloned man and others like him were willing participants, or maybe they just got him really stoned beforehand. In 1950, researchers did a full autopsy and examination of the taloned man, which included removing his hands and feet for preservation in a formaldehyde solution known as formalin. The study of his intestines suggested what was likely his final meal, a porridge or gruel made with a combination of cultivated and wild grains and seeds. A total of more than 40 different kinds of seeds were found in his digestive tract, along with barley, flax, false flax, and knotgrass. It's too bad he didn't make it into the 21st century. He would have loved acai bowls. Scientists also found pale persicaria seeds in the taloned man's gut, an unexpected find, as this plant was considered a weed, and its seeds would have been removed from grains prior to cooking. This weed seed consumption could be more evidence that the taloned man's fate was ritualistic. In 1976, Danish authorities took the taloned man's fingerprints, making them some of the oldest human fingerprints on record. So if he ever steals a valuable emerald, we've got him dead to rights. And in 2013, scientists even attempted to take some DNA samples from the taloned man. The hope is that one day, sequencing his genome and comparing it to modern-day Danes could prove vital clues about the population's history. Keeping the taloned man's body in adequate condition has been a significant challenge ever since its initial discovery. At first, its head was placed in a solution combining beeswax and alcohol, which scientists hoped would mimic the effect of bog water and help replenish some of the liquid in the corpse's cells. But when the mixture was washed off after 6 months, the head had shrunk around 12%. Wash it with cold water next time, guys. That's laundry 101. The rest of the taloned man's body had been left essentially alone, and continued to dry out at a fast pace in a laboratory setting, the corpse remains on display at the Silkeborg Museum in Denmark, though only the head is from the original find. The rest of the displayed body is a replica based on the original skeletal remains. Why a replica? Well, keeping track of the Talent Man's various body parts has become something of a challenge for Danish museum curators. After the initial 1950 excavation and examination, the body was cut up into several parts for preservation. While the head remained intact at the museum, over time, some of these other body parts went missing. The body's right toe was returned to the museum in 2016 by the daughter of a conservationist who had kept it for years in a glass jar on his desk. For normal reasons, for sure. It's a heck of a conversation piece. Though it's no longer the well-preserved specimen first unearthed over 70 years ago, some forms of research on the Talent Man corpse are probably still possible. Carbon dating has attempted to determine with greater accuracy the exact dates during which he lived. A 2015 examination by French anthropologist Dr. Philippe Charlier analyzed strange dots found on his feet that had not been previously investigated to see if they were potentially warts or even an early sign of heart disease. The discovery was also memorable enough to inspire writers and artists for the last 70 years. Novelists Margaret Drabble and Anne Youngson have both worked the Talent Man into their books. He's the subject of songs by American folk band The Mountain Goats and English rockers The Darkness. The find even got name-checked on an episode of TV's Bones. Now, that's the big time. Not bad for a guy who got tossed into a swamp over 2,000 years ago. Ancient Rome was the greatest power of its era and one of the most spectacularly impressive empires in history. But then one day, it all collapsed. While no one knows exactly why the empire disappeared into history, at least one researcher has proposed that the culprit might be something as simple as lead exposure. And while recent studies have uncovered high levels of lead in Imperial Rome's drinking water, the real danger might have been an artificial sweetener. Today, we're going to take a look at how Roman aristocrats might have poisoned themselves with artificial sweetener and destroyed the whole empire in the process. The Roman Empire had an incredible amount of wealth, and like pretty much all rich people, wealthy Romans loved to throw a good feast. Showing off one's bankroll by hosting elaborate dinner parties was basically a standard operating procedure for the Romans. Another was to sweeten the food with a thick grape syrup called sapa. The flavoring was made by boiling and skinning grapes, then mashing them through a sieve and mixing the paste with sugar. Sounds pretty yummy, right? Well, the problem is that Romans would cook the sapa in lead pots. The lead would then mix into the syrup, making it toxic. So while the sapa made the wealthy Romans' food taste better, it was also slowly poisoning them. Bittersweet indeed. Sapa may have been toxic, but the Romans loved it and used it for more than just sweetening foods. It was also used extensively in winemaking. Sapa was used to preserve wine, which had the unfortunate side effect of infusing the wine with poisonous lead. The Romans, much like a Real Housewife of Beverly Hills, had a large appetite for wine. The average Roman drank a liter of this stuff each day, which adds up to around 100 gallons of wine a year. That is a lot of lead, and we're just talking about the average Roman. Elite Romans drank even more heavily. For example, the Emperor Elagabalus was rumored to literally drink from a swimming pool full of wine. Not gonna invite him to my next party. Romans used sapa as a sweetener because it worked. The flavor does make wine and food taste better. But today we know that the syrup was toxic. Modern science has determined that due to being made in lead pots, the mixture contained a compound called lead acetate, also known as sugar of lead. We probably shouldn't take something so deadly and name it something that sounds so sweet. Downing as much lead acetate as the Romans did is not healthy. The side effects of the poisoning include dementia, infertility, and eventually complete organ shutdown, which is pretty bad because, you know, your organs are important. In the 1980s, research scientist Jerome Regu recreated sapa using ancient recipes that detailed the methods the Romans used to make the artificial sweetener. His results confirmed what he had long suspected, that the sapa turned out to contain a dangerous concentration of lead. Quantities ranged from 240 to 1,000 milligrams of lead per liter. That's way more lead than I like in my liter. Naregu explained that even 1 teaspoon of such a syrup would have been more than enough to give a person chronic lead poisoning. The Romans, of course, were ingesting far more. How dangerous was ancient Roman sapa? Well, it was so bad that if it existed today, it would be outlawed in the United States. And we're talking about a country that loves Big Macs and Four Loko. In fact, the modern threshold for lead is far, far lower. The Environmental Protection Agency will take action when drinking water reaches lead levels of 15 parts per billion. By comparison, ancient Roman sapa was practically exploding with lead, at a terrifying count of 2,900 parts per billion. That's nearly 200 times the enforceable amount regulated by the EPA today. So if lead pots were so dangerous, why did the Romans use them? Well, for one, they were completely oblivious of the danger. The notion of acid in the wine bonding with lead was a little chemistry advanced for them. But more importantly, Roman winemakers specifically used lead vessels to make the sapa because the end product would turn out noticeably sweeter. This, ironically, was an effect of the lead acetate, which, despite being a noxious compound, actually has a sweet taste. There were also problems with some of the alternatives. One ancient winemaker wrote that lead pots were better than brass because, in the boiling, brass vessels throw off copper rust, which has a disagreeable flavor. For Jerome Naregu, researching lead exposure in ancient Rome didn't stop at recreating the sapa. He also researched the diets of over 24 Roman emperors from 30 BCE to 220 CE. Based on his examinations, the scientist found evidence that as many as 19 emperors had a predilection to the lead-tainted wine and frequently enjoyed foods sweetened with sapa. The inescapable conclusion was that multiple Roman emperors almost certainly suffered from lead poisoning. That being the case, it's not a far jump to wonder whether the effects of the exposure on the emperor might have weakened the empire itself. As noted previously, exposure to lead can have many serious side effects. For example, long-term contamination can actually impair decision-making. But there were other risks too. Roman emperors, wealthy aristocrats, and others who consumed large amounts of lead were also more likely to have conditions like gout. In fact, multiple emperors showed signs of having the affliction during their reign. These included Claudius, Nero, Caligula, and Tiberius. These particular emperors were also known for their odd behavior, which is another thing you would expect of an individual who contracted lead poisoning. Speaking of odd behavior, the Roman Emperor Claudius took power after his nephew Caligula died at the hands of Rome's enemies in 37 CE. According to the ancients, Claudius, who evidently wasn't the hero type, hid behind a curtain while his nephew was getting killed. After he became emperor, Claudius's rule was marked by numerous uprisings. According to Jerome Naregu, Claudius had disturbed speech, weak limbs, an ungainly gait, tremor, fits of excessive and inappropriate laughter, and unseemly anger. Oh, and he often slobbered. I think I met that guy at the office party. These are classic signs of lead exposure, which dovetails nicely with ancient descriptions of Claudius being dull-witted and absent-minded. Or that last part might just mean that ancient historians weren't too fond of Claudius. So how often did the Romans use sapa to sweeten their foods? Well, one 4th century Roman recipe book known as the Apicius, or Apicius, if that's how you prefer your ancient Latin, included no less than 100 different recipes that all, in one way or another, incorporated lead acetate. They might have used so much sapa in their cooking because they just loved this stuff, but there might have been another, more scientific reason as well. Not too ironically, one side effect of lead exposure is a metallic taste in the mouth. If the Romans were experiencing that taste, it likely would have encouraged them to use even more sapa to cover it up, which would lead to a more metallic taste in the mouth, which would lead to a need for more sapa, which would lead to, well, you get it. So, despite the repeated warnings about lead poisoning, it's likely some of you are wondering if there's a way you can make your own sapa. Well, don't worry. Pliny the Elder has you covered. Pliny detailed the recipe and process for making sapa way back in the 1st century. Sounding like a hipster owner of a microbrewery, Pliny wrote, "Sapa is a product of art, not nature." He then explained that his art began by boiling down the unfermented grape juice to 1/3 of its original quantity. He was careful to distinguish this from defrutum, a different recipe that called for the grape juice to be boiled to 1/2 of its volume. Sapa, Pliny stressed, was more concentrated. This reduction would have made the sapa much sweeter than grape juice, and the Romans then further sweetened it by boiling it in lead pots. While we at Weird History would strongly recommend to not use lead pots, the rest of Pliny's recipe still works today. Moreover, sapa itself, to be perfectly clear, is completely safe to consume. It's only toxic if it's been heated in a lead vessel. So what if they hadn't used lead pots to cook the sapa? Would history be different? Would the Roman Empire have lasted another 1,000 years? It's always hard to answer hypotheticals, but it's at least possible nothing would be different because even without the sapa, Romans still had a lot of lead in their diets. The water many Romans drank was spring water that had been transported across the empire in aqueducts and lead pipes. Those pipes transferred lead right into the water, exposing the population to the heavy metal. Sapa or no sapa, the Romans were swimming in lead. So about that water, after traveling through the lead pipes, Rome's water supply would have become contaminated with lead. How contaminated? Well, researchers recently estimated that the Roman water supply probably contained 100 times the levels of lead that would have been found in local spring water. And this wasn't just guesswork, it's science. The researchers actually compared sediments from local ports with traces of water found in ancient Roman pipes. The scientists ultimately concluded that the levels were probably too low to cause significant harm, but they acknowledged that drinking water contaminated with any amount of lead can be dangerous and problematic. Given how widely sapa was used and enjoyed in the ancient Roman Empire, it's easy to assume that lead contamination was a major problem. But not all scholars agree. Oh, come on, scholars, just agree on something. In fact, when Jerome Regu first introduced the lead poisoning theory for Rome's decline in the 1980s, he immediately received a ton of pushback. He argued with other historians who called his theory a myth, and they claimed the Romans knew that lead was harmful. Moreover, it was pointed out that sapa was used for centuries before Rome's fall, even during its golden age, which makes it difficult to pin the decline on its use. And indeed, modern researchers who have examined lead levels in ancient Roman drinking water have dismissed the idea that lead could have been the primary cause of Rome's downfall. Nevertheless, many find it hard to completely reject the notion that centuries of consuming lead-tainted artificial sweeteners certainly couldn't have been good for Rome either. Imagine you're a dinosaur, let's say an Alamosaurus around 66 million years ago. The sun is set and you're minding your own business, just lumbering around an area that'll eventually be called Austin, Texas, when something glowing in the sky catches your eye. You're not too concerned, but you keep an eye on that weird glowing star for a couple of hours anyway. The thing is, the star keeps getting brighter, but it doesn't seem to be moving, so you forget about it. Then out of nowhere, around 60 hours later, you feel the thunderous boom of a supersonic shockwave. That thing you hoped might be a routine shooting star is actually an asteroid around 6 miles wide. 6 miles wide. Before you can even think, what the hell was that? The thing you thought was a star 60 hours ago plunges 18 miles into the Earth, and you die immediately. Today we're going to do a step-by-step breakdown of the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs for a couple of months. Debris from both the asteroid's impact in the Western Hemisphere and volcanic activity in the Eastern Hemisphere blocked out the sun's light. The plants that survived impact died from lack of light. Without any vegetation, surviving herbivores succumbed to starvation, and the carnivores quickly followed. Scientists have hypothesized the mass extinction eliminated 75% of all species and wiped out 99.9999% of all living organisms. For many years after, the Earth was toxic. Due to the asteroid's heat and impact, many minerals vaporized and released dangerous gases into the atmosphere, including greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and methane. One of the more immediately damaging effects, however, was from sulfur. Sulfur was introduced into the water cycle, creating sulfuric acid and causing subsequent acid rain. About 45 minutes after impact, a thunderous blast of wind would tear through ground zero at 600 miles an hour, blasting debris everywhere and leveling anything that might still be standing. The sound of the explosion would arrive at the same time, around 105 decibels, about as loud as if you were standing underneath the rotors of a Huey helicopter. For the first few hours, there would have been close to total darkness, but soon after that, the sky would begin to lighten. For anyone or anything out of range of the direct effects of the asteroid explosion, one would be treated to the sight of dark skies and a display of shooting stars created by the impact debris raining back on Earth. They wouldn't have looked quite like regular shooting stars or meteors, though. Meteors burn up at higher speeds and get hotter. These shooting stars would have been re-entering the atmosphere at lower altitudes, traveling slower and emitting infrared radiation. The best guess is that the atmosphere would have been some sort of red glow. After the red glow, the sky would darken as ash and debris swirling around the globe created a creeping twilight. During the following weeks, months, and maybe even years, the skies were probably somewhere between twilight and a very cloudy day. Once the dust literally settled, one of the more distinctive clues that the asteroid left us was a thick layer of clay packed with iridium, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. This layer is known as the KT or KPG boundary, marking the end of the Cretaceous period and the beginning of the Tertiary period, or Paleogene. Walter Alvarez, the UC Berkeley professor who, along with his father, Nobelist Louis Alvarez of UC Berkeley, were the first to recognize the significance of iridium that was found in the same 66-million-year-old rock layers around the world. They proposed that a comet or asteroid impact was responsible for both the iridium at the KT boundary and the mass extinction. While most scientists agree that the effects of the Chicxulub asteroid killed off the non-aerial dinosaurs, some scientists still claim volcanic eruptions wiped them out rather than the asteroid. New evidence suggests both may have contributed to the mass extinction. While the Chicxulub asteroid smashed into Earth, it triggered earthquakes with magnitudes as high as 11 on the Richter scale, strong enough to be felt on the opposite side of the globe. The theory is that the asteroid's impact may have led to volcanic eruptions in India. Nearly 200,000 square miles of lava spread across the region known as the Deccan Traps. This would have released disruptive toxic gases into the atmosphere and generated enough ash to block out sunlight for years. While most accounts focus on the crazy violence and destruction from those first few minutes to days after the impact of the Chicxulub asteroid, it was the long-term environmental effects that ultimately wiped out most dinosaurs and much of the rest of the life on Earth. The lack of sun caused by the dust cloud meant photosynthesis would have been incredibly reduced. The soot and ash would have taken months to filter out of the atmosphere, and when it did, the rain would have fallen as acidic mud. Further massive fires would have produced huge amounts of toxins that temporarily destroyed the planet's protective ozone layer. Then there was the carbon footprint of the impact itself, which released an estimated 10,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide, 100 billion tons of carbon monoxide, and another 100 billion tons of methane in one fell swoop. Scientists still debate many of the details, which are derived from computer models and field studies of the debris layer, knowledge of extinction rates, fossils and microfossils, and many other clues. But one thing just about every one of them agree on is the fact that the Chicxulub asteroid landed just off of Mexico and tore it up. How do you think it all went down? What would you do if NASA spotted another 6-mile-wide asteroid hurtling towards Earth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.